The field exercise would be more than just a test of tactical skills and leadership abilities. It would be a proving ground for the new values that had taken root at the academy, and a demonstration of whether the changes of the past few months represented genuine growth or merely a temporary disruption of the old order. As Sarah prepared for the challenge ahead, she knew that the lessons learned in the coming week would shape not only her own future, but the futures of every cadet under her command. The stakes were higher than any academic exercise should warrant, but then again, the best lessons were often learned when the consequences of failure were real and meaningful. The transformation of Riverside Military Academy was far from complete, but it had reached a critical juncture. The field exercise would determine whether the seeds of positive change would take root permanently, or whether the old patterns of behavior would reassert themselves under pressure. For Sarah and her fellow cadets, it represented both an opportunity and a responsibility that would define their understanding of leadership for years to come. 2 months had passed since the night that changed everything at Riverside Military Academy, and the transformation was now visible to even the most casual observer. The rigid atmosphere of fear that had previously characterized interactions between cadets had been replaced by something approaching genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. Younger cadets walked with confidence rather than constantly looking over their shoulders, while upperclassmen had begun to take pride in their role as mentors rather than enforcers. Sarah had settled into academy life more completely than she had expected. Her initial plan to simply complete her education while maintaining emotional distance from her classmates had gradually evolved as she found herself drawn into the community despite her reservations. Her reputation as someone who had stood up to institutional bullying had made her a natural point of contact for cadets dealing with various challenges, though she was careful to avoid becoming a substitute authority figure. The academic year's major leadership exercise was approaching, a week-long field training exercise that would test everything the cadets had learned about tactics, strategy, and command. Colonel Harrison had announced that this year's exercise would be different from previous years, with leadership positions assigned based on demonstrated competence and character rather than simple seniority. Marcus Thompson had requested a meeting with Sarah 3 days before the exercise was scheduled to begin. She found him waiting outside the library, his appearance neat and professional but lacking the arrogant confidence that had once defined his presence. The months since his fall from power had clearly taken their toll, but there was something different in his posture now, a humility that seemed genuine rather than forced. "Martinez," he said, rising from the bench where he had been waiting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah studied his face, noting the absence of the calculating expression that had once made every interaction feel like a chess match. "What did you want to discuss, Marcus?" "The field exercise," he replied. "I know I'm not likely to be selected for any leadership positions given my history, but I wanted to ask if you'd consider allowing me to serve under your command, if you're chosen as a unit leader." The request caught Sarah off guard. She had expected many things from Marcus Thompson, but genuine humility had not been among them. "Why would you want to do that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to express thoughts that challenged everything he had once believed about himself. "Because I need to learn what real leadership looks like. I spent 3 years thinking I was a leader, but what I actually was a tyrant. A bully with a uniform and some authority." He gestured toward the academy buildings around them. "Look at what's happened since that night in the gymnasium. The place is functioning better than it ever did under my system. Cadets are performing better academically, morale is higher, and people actually want to be here instead of just enduring it until graduation." Sarah remained silent, allowing him to continue working through his thoughts. "I keep asking myself how I got it so wrong," Marcus continued. "I had every advantage: family connections, natural abilities, opportunities that most people never get. But instead of using those advantages to build something positive, I used them to tear people down. I made this place worse instead of better. And you think serving under my command would teach you something different?" Sarah asked. Marcus nodded. "I think watching someone who actually knows how to lead might teach me things I should have learned years ago. If you'll have me." Sarah considered the request carefully. Her instinct was to maintain distance from Marcus and the complications his presence might bring to any unit she commanded. But she also recognized the courage it must have taken for him to make this request, knowing how his former victims might react to seeing him in a subordinate role. If I'm selected for a leadership position, Sarah said finally, and if you're assigned to my unit, you'll be treated exactly like every other team member. No special consideration, no accommodation for your pride or your previous status. You'll follow orders, support the mission, and put the team's success ahead of your personal comfort. Are you prepared for that? Yes, Marcus replied without hesitation. I understand that I'll have to earn whatever respect I receive. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better than I was. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Jake Rodriguez, who had been walking across the campus and had spotted them near the library. Jake's adaptation to the new order at the academy had been more calculated than Marcus's soul-searching, positioning himself as a reformed character while carefully avoiding any real accountability for his past actions. Well, Jake said with his characteristic smirk, the fallen king having a heart-to-heart with the giant killer. How touching? Sarah's expression hardened at Jake's tone, recognizing the same manipulative cynicism that had made him effective as Marcus's lieutenant. Is there something you needed, Rodriguez? Jake's smirk widened. Just curious about this touching scene of redemption. Marcus here trying to worm his way back into relevance by kissing up to the new power structure? Marcus's face flushed with anger. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped between the two men. That's enough, Rodriguez. Whatever issues you have with Thompson, you can settle them somewhere else. Issues? Jake laughed. I don't have any issues with Marcus. We worked together very effectively for 3 years. I'm just amused by his sudden conversion to humility. It's quite a performance. It's not a performance, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even Sarah. It's an attempt to become someone worth respecting instead of someone worth fearing. Jake's expression shifted to something closer to disgust. Pathetic. You used to have backbone, Marcus. Now you're just another broken cadet looking for redemption from someone who got lucky one night. Sarah felt her temper rising at Jake's deliberate provocation, but before she could respond, Marcus spoke again. You're right, Jake, I am broken. The person I was before was fundamentally flawed, built on false assumptions about what strength and leadership meant. But being broken isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning of becoming something better. Jake stared at Marcus for a long moment, clearly expecting a different response. When it became apparent that his former leader was not going to be baited into an argument, Jake shrugged and walked away, muttering something about weakness and wasted opportunities. You handled that well, Sarah observed after Jake had disappeared around the corner of the library. Marcus nodded, though his hands were still shaking slightly from the confrontation. A few months ago, I would have tried to re-establish dominance through intimidation or violence. But I'm learning that real strength sometimes means choosing not to fight. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Marcus's growth, though she remained cautious about trusting it completely. The field exercise will be a good test of whether you've really internalized these lessons, or if you're just going through the motions. I know, Marcus replied. And I know that some people will never believe I've really changed. But I have to try. The alternative is spending the rest of my life being the person I was, and I can't live with that anymore. The next day, Colonel Harrison announced the leadership assignments for the field exercise. Sarah had been selected as the commanding officer for Bravo Company, a recognition of her natural leadership abilities and the respect she had earned from her fellow cadets. To her surprise, Marcus had indeed been assigned to her unit, along with Danny Chen, Robert Morrison, and several other cadets whose development had been shaped by the events of the past few months. As the company gathered for its first briefing, Sarah looked around at the faces of her team members. She saw determination, nervousness, and in some cases, skepticism about whether the new dynamics at the academy would hold up under the pressure of a demanding field exercise. Over the next week, Sarah began, her voice carrying the natural authority that came from genuine experience. We're going to be tested in ways that will reveal who we really are as individuals and as a team. Some of you have known each other for years, while others are still learning to trust and work together. She made eye contact with each member of the company before continuing. Success in this exercise won't depend on who can shout the loudest or intimidate the most people. It will depend on our ability to communicate effectively, support each other, and adapt to changing circumstances. Everyone here has something valuable to contribute, and everyone here will be given the opportunity to prove themselves. Marcus felt a surge of something he had not experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since the night in the gymnasium, He could envision a future where he might be respected for who he was becoming, rather than feared for who he had been. As the company dispersed to prepare for the exercise, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at Riverside. She had come seeking education and anonymity, but had instead found herself at the center of a transformation that had affected not just individual cadets, but the entire culture of the institution. The days following the confrontation in the old gymnasium brought an unprecedented shift to the social dynamics at Riverside Military Academy. Word of Sarah's demonstration had spread through the cadet corps with the speed and thoroughness that only institutional gossip could achieve, though the details grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed she had defeated 5 upperclassmen simultaneously, while others insisted she was a former Special Forces operative who had been sent to investigate corruption at the academy. Sarah found herself at the center of attention she neither wanted nor encouraged. Younger cadets approached her with expressions of hero worship, seeking advice or simply wanting to bask in the presence of someone who had finally stood up to the system that had intimidated them for so long. She deflected their questions politely but firmly, making it clear that she had not come to the academy to become anyone's savior or symbol. Marcus Thompson had become a ghost of his former self, moving through the academy with the hollow-eyed expression of someone whose entire identity had been stripped away overnight. His followers had abandoned him with the ruthless efficiency that characterized most institutional power structures when the foundation shifted. Jake Rodriguez had quickly aligned himself with other upperclassmen who were positioning themselves to fill the power vacuum, while Danny Chen had withdrawn into himself, spending long hours in the academy's weight room as if he could somehow rebuild his shattered confidence through physical exertion. The administration had taken notice of the changing atmosphere, though they attributed it to the natural evolution of cadet leadership, rather than any specific incident. Colonel Harrison, the academy's commandant, was actually pleased with what he observed during his regular inspections. The harsh edge that had characterized interactions between upperclassmen and underclassmen seemed to have softened, replaced by something that looked more like genuine mentorship and mutual respect. Sarah's academic performance exceeded all expectations, though this came as no surprise to anyone who looked closely at her background. Her instructors found her contributions to classroom discussions thoughtful and well-informed, particularly in courses dealing with military history and leadership theory. She had a way of analyzing historical battles and strategic decisions that suggested practical experience rather than purely academic knowledge. Professor Williams, who taught advanced military strategy, became particularly intrigued by Sarah's insights during discussions of asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Her understanding of these topics was far more sophisticated than what any textbook could provide, and her questions often revealed gaps in the academic treatment of subjects that she clearly understood from first-hand experience. Miss Martinez, Professor Williams said after one particularly illuminating class discussion, "Your perspective on these topics is quite remarkable. Have you considered pursuing advanced studies in strategic analysis after graduation?" Sarah appreciated the professor's interest, but she was still figuring out what she wanted her post-academy life to look like. "I'm focused on completing my undergraduate degree right now, Professor, but thank you for the suggestion." Meanwhile, the vacuum left by Marcus's fall from power was creating interesting dynamics throughout the cadet corps. Robert Morrison, the quiet cadet who had been among the first to stand up in the gymnasium, found himself emerging as an unexpected leader among his classmates. His approach was collaborative rather than authoritarian, seeking consensus and input rather than demanding blind obedience. Other cadets who had previously lived in fear of Marcus's regime began to discover their own voices and capabilities. Study groups formed organically, with upperclassmen genuinely helping younger cadets master difficult subjects, rather than using academic superiority as another tool of intimidation. The Academy's honor code, which had previously been honored more in the breach than in the observance, began to take on real meaning as cadets stopped covering for each other's misconduct out of fear. The most dramatic change came in the Academy's approach to disciplinary issues. Previously, infractions had been handled through Marcus's informal system of justice, which often involved physical punishment or social ostracism that went far beyond anything officially sanctioned. Now problems were being addressed through proper channels, with cadets actually trusting the official disciplinary process to be fair and proportionate. 3 weeks after the gymnasium incident, Sarah was approached by Captain Stevens, one of the Academy's tactical instructors and a former Army Ranger. Stevens had been quietly observing the changes in cadet behavior and had drawn his own conclusions about their cause. "Walk with me, Cadet Martinez," Stevens said after dismissing his class on small unit tactics. His tone was conversational but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. They walked across the academy grounds in comfortable silence until they reached a quiet bench overlooking the parade field where younger cadets were practicing close-order drill. Stevens sat down and gestured for Sarah to join him. "You know," Stevens said, his eyes focused on the drilling cadets, "I've been teaching here for 8 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of different leadership styles among the cadet corps. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between." Sarah remained silent, recognizing that Stevens was building towards something important. "The interesting thing about leadership," Stevens continued, "is that it reveals itself most clearly in moments of crisis. When someone's comfortable authority is challenged, you get to see what they're really made of." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "I'm curious about your thoughts on that subject, given your apparent experience with crisis situations." Sarah considered her response carefully. Stevens was clearly fishing for information about her background, but his approach was professional rather than confrontational. "In my experience, Captain, real leaders rise to meet challenges while false leaders crumble under pressure." "The crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it." Stevens nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And what we've seen over the past few weeks has been very revealing indeed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't suppose you'd care to share any insights about what might have caused such a dramatic shift in cadet behavior?" "People sometimes need to be reminded that there are alternatives to accepting unacceptable situations," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Once they see that change is possible, they often find the courage to make it happen themselves." "Interesting perspective," Stevens said. "It reminds me of something I learned during my own military service. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to demonstrate that their apparent strength is actually weakness, and that their victims have more power than they realize." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Danny Chen, who had been walking across the parade field and had spotted them on the bench. His left arm was still slightly stiff from the nerve damage Sarah had inflicted, but his expression was thoughtful rather than hostile. "Captain Stevens," Danny said, offering a respectful salute. "Cadet Martinez." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I was wondering if I could speak with both of you about something." Stevens gestured for Danny to join them on the bench. "What's on your mind, Cadet Chen?" Danny looked uncomfortable but determined. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened a few weeks ago, about the way things were before and the way they are now." He turned to Sarah. "I want to apologize for my behavior, not just that night but for everything that led up to it. The way we treated people, the way we used fear to get what we wanted, it was wrong." Sarah studied Danny's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine remorse and something that might have been relief. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "The thing is," Danny continued, "I don't know how to be different. I've been angry and aggressive for so long that I don't really know who I am without that. Marcus made it seem like strength meant making other people afraid of you. But what you did that night, that was real strength, and it didn't involve making anyone afraid." Stevens leaned forward with interest. "What do you think the difference is, Chen?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling to articulate thoughts he had never put into words before. "I think real strength is about protecting people instead of hurting them, about building them up instead of tearing them down. But I don't know how to do that." "It's learnable," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "The same way you learn to intimidate people, you can learn to inspire them. The same way you learn to use your size to make people afraid, you can learn to use it to make them feel safe." "But how?" Danny asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Stevens smiled, recognizing a teachable moment when he saw one. "It starts with understanding that true leadership is service, Chen. Instead of asking what you can make people do for you, you ask what you can do for them. Instead of demanding respect, you earn it by being worthy of it." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And it means being willing to admit when you're wrong, to learn from your mistakes, and to change when change is needed. You're already doing that by being here, having this conversation. The silence in the old gymnasium stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by Danny's labored breathing as he struggled to understand what had happened to him. The upperclassmen in the bleachers sat frozen, their minds trying to process the impossible scene before them. Danny Chen, the academy's most feared enforcer, was on his knees, defeated by a woman half his size who didn't even appear to be breathing hard. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. For 3 years, his authority had been built on the foundation of Danny's physical dominance and Jake's cunning intelligence. With Danny neutralized so easily, the entire structure of power he had created was suddenly revealed as an illusion built on intimidation rather than genuine leadership. "What are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the cavernous space. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm someone who's seen real combat, Marcus. Someone who's fought actual enemies instead of picking on kids who are just trying to get an education." She gestured toward Danny, who was slowly regaining some feeling in his left arm. "This isn't warfare. This isn't even fighting. This is just bullying with better uniforms." Jake took a step backward, his sharp mind finally recognizing the signs he should have noticed from the beginning. Sarah's posture, her awareness of her surroundings, the way she moved with economic precision. These were all indicators of professional military training far beyond anything the academy provided. "You're not just a transfer student," he said, his voice tight with realization. "You're military. Real military," Sarah corrected. "I'm here because I want to build something new, learn something different. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten everything I learned in the service." She looked around the gymnasium, taking in the faces of the upperclassmen who had come to watch her humiliation. The question now is what happens next. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. Everything he had built, every relationship he had cultivated, every plan he had made for his future, all of it depended on maintaining the image of unquestioned dominance that Sarah had just shattered with surgical precision. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice carrying a desperation that undermined the threat he was trying to convey. "You think you can just come here and tear down everything we've built?" "This academy has traditions, Martinez. Systems that work," Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're right about traditions and systems. The military is built on both. But real military traditions are about honor, duty, and protecting those who can't protect themselves. What you've built here isn't tradition. It's just institutionalized abuse." Danny finally managed to get back to his feet, though his movements were unsteady and his left arm still hung uselessly at his side. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion rather than anger. "I've never felt anything like that before." "Pressure points," Sarah explained matter-of-factly. "Nerve clusters that can disable an opponent without causing permanent damage. It's part of close-quarters combat training, the kind you learn when your life depends on being able to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently." The clinical way she described her techniques sent a chill through everyone present. This wasn't the random luck of an inexperienced fighter. This was the controlled application of lethal skills adapted for a non-lethal situation. Marcus felt his options narrowing with each passing second. Backing down would destroy his reputation irreparably, but escalating the confrontation was clearly futile. Sarah had demonstrated capabilities that were far beyond anything he or his followers possessed. "You want to know what real leadership looks like?" Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded others in life or death situations. "It looks like putting yourself at risk to protect your people. It looks like making hard decisions based on what's right, not what's convenient. It looks like earning respect through competence and character, not fear and intimidation." Jake found his voice again, though it came out as little more than a croak. "What do you want from us?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I want you to stop. All of this, the intimidation, the hazing, the abuse of younger cadets, it ends now. You can still be leaders, but you'll have to learn how to do it without terrorizing people into submission." "And if we refuse?" Marcus asked, though his voice carried little conviction. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew harder. "Then you'll discover that what happened to Danny was me being gentle. I've spent years learning how to neutralize threats permanently when necessary. I really hope it won't be necessary here." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that it carried more weight than any amount of shouting or posturing could have achieved. Everyone present understood that they were in the presence of someone for whom violence was a tool to be applied with surgical precision when diplomacy failed. One of the upperclassmen in the bleachers, a quiet cadet named Robert who had been one of Marcus's earliest victims, stood up slowly. "She's right," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "What we've been doing here, what we've allowed to happen, it's not leadership. It's not honorable. It's just cruelty." Marcus spun toward Robert, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Sit down, Morrison. This doesn't concern you." But Robert remained standing, and his words seemed to break a spell that had held the other upperclassmen captive for years. Several others rose to their feet, their faces showing a mixture of shame and determination. "Actually, it does concern us," said another cadet, her voice carrying clearly across the gymnasium. "We've all been part of this system. We've all participated in it, whether we wanted to or not. But that doesn't mean we have to keep participating." Sarah watched the rebellion unfold with professional interest. She had seen similar moments in military units where toxic leadership was finally challenged by subordinates who had found their courage. The key was to support the momentum without trying to control it. "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice rising to near panic. "Without structure, without discipline, this whole place falls apart. The academy needs strong leadership." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed, surprising everyone, including Marcus. "The academy does need strong leadership. But strength isn't about who can intimidate the most people or cause the most fear. Real strength is about protecting others, building them up, helping them become the best versions of themselves." She gestured toward the cadets who had stood up in the bleachers. "That's what real leadership looks like, Marcus. People choosing to follow a principle because they believe in it, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't." Marcus looked around the gymnasium, seeing his carefully constructed empire crumbling before his eyes. The cadets who had once followed him out of fear were now looking at him with something approaching disgust. Even Jake was backing away, clearly unwilling to associate himself with a lost cause. Danny, still nursing his injured arm, looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Now you all have a choice. You can keep trying to lead through fear and intimidation, in which case you'll discover that someone with real training is willing to stop you. Or you can learn what actual leadership means and become the kind of officers this academy is supposed to produce." She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze steady and implacable. "The choice is yours, Marcus. But the reign of terror ends tonight one way or another." The old gymnasium stood at the far edge of the academy campus, a relic from the school's early days that had been replaced by modern facilities but never demolished. Its windows were grimy with age, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete steps leading to the entrance. The building served no official purpose anymore, making it the perfect location for activities that the administration preferred not to know about. Sarah arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. Her punctuality as much a part of her military conditioning as her physical fitness and tactical awareness. She had spent the previous day observing the campus, noting the patrol patterns of security guards and identifying the various ways in and out of different buildings. Old habits died hard, and reconnaissance had kept her alive in places where a single mistake meant death. The gymnasium's interior was lit by a few working overhead bulbs that cast harsh shadows across the old wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the yellow light, and the air smelled of disuse and decay. Marcus stood in the center of the space, flanked by Jake and Danny, their positions suggesting they had been waiting for some time. Several other upperclassmen occupied the bleachers along one wall, their presence indicating that this confrontation had been advertised as entertainment. "Punctual," Marcus observed as Sarah entered through the main doors. "I appreciate that in a subordinate. It shows you understand the importance of following orders, even if you're still confused about other aspects of military courtesy." Sarah walked to the center of the gymnasium floor, stopping about 10 feet away from the 3 cadets. Her movements were economical and precise, suggesting a level of physical conditioning that went beyond the standard academy fitness requirements. "You said you wanted to settle the question of hierarchy," she said. "I'm here to listen to your proposal." Marcus smiled, feeling more confident now that he was on familiar ground. The old gymnasium had been the site of dozens of similar confrontations over the years, each one ending with the clear establishment of his dominance and the complete submission of whoever had been foolish enough to challenge the established order. "The proposal is simple," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to the upperclassmen in the bleachers, "a demonstration of proper respect for your betters. You'll acknowledge my authority as class leader, provide the information we requested, and accept your position in the hierarchy. In return, your time at Riverside will proceed smoothly and without unnecessary complications." "And if I decline?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting she was merely seeking clarification rather than issuing a challenge. Danny stepped forward eagerly, having waited all day for this moment. "Then we teach you some manners the hard way," he said, cracking his knuckles for emphasis. "Nothing permanent, you understand. Just enough to help you see reason." Sarah nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable arrangement. "I see, so my choices are submission or violence. Those are the only options you're offering?" Marcus felt a moment of uncertainty at her calm acceptance of the situation. In his experience, this was the point where cadets either broke down completely or made desperate attempts to negotiate their way out of the confrontation. Sarah's analytical approach to what was clearly a threat situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. "Those are the traditional options," Marcus confirmed, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Though I'd hardly call it violence. More like an educational experience. Character building, you might say." "Character building," Sarah repeated thoughtfully, "through physical intimidation and coercion. That's an interesting leadership philosophy." She looked around the gymnasium, taking in the positioning of the spectators and the various exits. "Tell me, Marcus, how many cadets have you educated this way?" The question caught him off guard. In his mind, the confrontations were about maintaining order and discipline, not about counting victims. "Enough to maintain the standards this academy deserves," he replied defensively. Jake sensed that the conversation was taking an unexpected turn and decided to move things along. "Look, Martinez, this doesn't have to be complicated. Just show proper respect and we can all move on with our lives." Sarah turned her attention to Jake, studying him with the same intensity she had shown Marcus. "Respect," she said. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? You want me to fear you enough to obey you without question? That's not respect, Jake. That's just fear wearing a uniform." The comment struck home with several of the upperclassmen watching from the bleachers. Some of them had been on the receiving end of Marcus's educational sessions in their early days at the academy, and they recognized the truth in Sarah's words even if they would never admit it publicly. Marcus felt his carefully constructed authority beginning to crack under the weight of Sarah's calm analysis. "You talk too much, Martinez. Danny, I think it's time for the practical portion of tonight's lesson." Danny grinned and stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the gymnasium floor. At 6 feet 4 inches and 250 pounds of solid muscle, he had never met a physical challenge he couldn't overcome through brute force. "Last chance to do this the easy way," he warned, rolling his shoulders to emphasize his size advantage. Sarah looked up at Danny without any sign of intimidation. "The easy way would have been treating me with basic human dignity from the beginning," she said. But apparently that wasn't an option. Danny lunged forward, his military training evident in the efficiency of his movement. He aimed for a simple takedown, intending to grab Sarah around the waist and drive her to the ground where his size advantage would be overwhelming. It was a technique that had worked countless times before against smaller, weaker opponents. Sarah sidestepped the charge with fluid grace, her movement so economical that Danny found himself grasping empty air while his momentum carried him past her. Before he could recover his balance, Sarah's elbow connected with a pressure point just below his ear, a precise strike that sent him stumbling sideways with his vision blurred and his equilibrium compromised. The speed and efficiency of the counterattack stunned everyone watching. Danny was known throughout the academy for his physical prowess, and seeing him neutralized so easily challenged everything they thought they knew about combat and dominance. Danny shook his head to clear it and turned back toward Sarah, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he growled, raising his fists in a more traditional fighting stance. "Won't happen again." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her posture shifted subtly into a ready position that those with combat experience would have recognized as a highly trained fighting stance. Her breathing remained controlled, her expression calm, and her eyes tracked Danny's movement with the precision of a predator evaluating prey. Marcus watched the exchange with growing alarm. This was not proceeding according to plan, and Danny's failure to immediately dominate the confrontation was undermining everything Marcus had built his reputation on. "Danny, stop playing around," he ordered. "End this." Danny charged again, this time with more caution and better technique. He threw a combination of punches designed to overwhelm Sarah's defenses through sheer aggression, each blow carrying enough force to incapacitate an ordinary opponent. Sarah moved like water, flowing around Danny's attacks with an economy of motion that spoke of countless hours of training and real-world application. Her counterstrikes were surgical in their precision, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points that Danny didn't even know existed. Within seconds, his left arm was numb from the shoulder down, and his breathing was labored from a blow to his solar plexus that he never saw coming. The gymnasium fell silent, except for Danny's ragged breathing and the sound of his knees hitting the wooden floor. He remained conscious but completely unable to continue fighting, his body betraying him in ways he had never experienced before. Sarah stood over him, not even breathing hard, her expression showing neither satisfaction nor cruelty. She looked up at Marcus and Jake, both of whom were staring at the scene with expressions of complete shock. "Now," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence, "would you like to discuss respect again? Because I think we might have different definitions of what that word means." Sarah opened the door to find 3 upperclassmen standing in the hallway, their posture radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from years of unchallenged authority. The tall blonde one stood closest to her door, his hand still raised from knocking, while his 2 companions flanked him in a formation that blocked most of the hallway. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture perfect, and their expressions carried the cold confidence of predators who had never encountered anything they couldn't dominate. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate attention, the new transfer student. "I'm Marcus Thompson, 3rd-year class leader. These are my associates, Jake Rodriguez and Danny Chen. We make it our business to welcome new cadets and help them understand how things work around here." Sarah studied the 3, young men with the same careful attention she had once, reserved for potential insurgents in hostile territory. Marcus was clearly the alpha, his bearing and the deference of the others marking him as their leader. Jake appeared to be the intelligence gatherer, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of her appearance and surroundings. Danny was the muscle, his thick frame and aggressive stance designed to intimidate through physical presence alone. "Sarah Martinez," she replied simply, offering no additional information. She kept her voice level and her posture relaxed, showing neither deference nor aggression. It was a neutral stance that revealed nothing about her capabilities while keeping all options open. Marcus smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Martinez, interesting. You're older than most incoming cadets. Military family?" He stepped slightly closer, invading her personal space in a way that was technically respectful but psychologically aggressive. It was a move designed to make her step back, to establish his dominance through the simple act of claiming territory. Sarah didn't move. She had faced down armed terrorists and hostile interrogators. A college student playing power games was hardly intimidating. "Something like that," she said, matching his smile with one equally empty of warmth. The subtle standoff lasted several seconds, neither party willing to be the first to break eye contact. Jake shifted uncomfortably, recognizing something in Sarah's demeanor that made him uneasy. Danny remained oblivious, his attention focused on the physical aspects of the confrontation. "Well, Sarah," Marcus continued, finally taking a half step back while maintaining his commanding tone. "Riverside has traditions, ways of doing things that have worked for generations. New cadets, especially transfers, sometimes need help understanding their place in the hierarchy. We're here to provide that education." "How thoughtful," Sarah replied, her tone giving nothing away. She could see where this was heading, recognizing the classic pattern of institutional bullying dressed up as tradition and mentorship. Every military organization had its version of this dynamic, and she had seen it play out countless times in various forms. Jake decided to assert himself, stepping forward with a clipboard that materialized from nowhere. "We'll need some information for our records. Previous schools, family military service, special training, standard stuff for all transfers." His tone suggested that compliance was not optional. Sarah glanced at the clipboard, then back at Jake's expectant face. "I'm sure the administration has all the information they need. If there's something specific the Academy requires, they know how to reach me. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's smile became thinner, more predatory. In his experience, new cadets either cowered immediately or attempted to bluster their way through the encounter. Sarah's calm refusal to engage on his terms was something entirely new, and it triggered his competitive instincts. "I think there might be some confusion here," Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This isn't a request, Martinez. This is how things work. Upperclassmen provide guidance, underclassmen show proper respect. It's been that way since before you got here, and it'll be that way long after you're gone." Danny cracked his knuckles loudly, a sound that echoed off the hallway walls. "Maybe she needs a demonstration of how things work around here," he suggested, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had cowed dozens of previous cadets. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a barely perceptible adjustment that brought her weight onto the balls of her feet. Those with combat experience would have recognized the movement as a transition to a ready stance, but to the three cadets, it appeared as nothing more than a slight shift in position. "I understand hierarchies," Sarah said quietly. "I also understand that respect is earned, not demanded. If you have something specific you need from me, you're welcome to ask. If you're here to play games, you're wasting both our time." The directness of her response caught all three cadets off guard. In their experience, intimidation worked through a predictable pattern of escalation and submission. Sarah's refusal to follow the script left them uncertain about how to proceed without losing face in front of each other. Marcus felt his authority being challenged in a way that struck at the core of his identity. For 3 years, he had built his reputation on the ability to command immediate compliance from anyone he encountered. The thought that a transfer student, a woman no less, might not recognize his superiority was intolerable. "Games?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You think this is a game? This academy has produced some of the finest military officers in the country. The discipline and structure that create those officers starts with understanding your place. If you can't grasp that concept, maybe you don't belong here." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words carefully. "You're absolutely right about discipline and structure. In my experience, the best leaders earn respect through competence and character, not through intimidation and posturing. But everyone has their own approach." The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. To be lectured about leadership by someone he considered beneath him was humiliating enough. But to have his methods characterized as intimidation and posturing in front of his followers was unacceptable. Jake sensed the escalating tension and attempted to defuse the situation. "Look, Martinez, nobody's trying to give you a hard time. We're just following traditions that have worked for generations. All we need is some basic information and acknowledgement that you understand how things work around here." Sarah turned her attention to Jake, studying him with the same intensity she had focused on Marcus. "And what happens if I choose not to provide that information or acknowledgement?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defiance. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Danny stepped forward, his massive frame filling the space between Sarah and the other two cadets. "Then we help you understand why cooperation is in your best interests," he said, his meaning unmistakable. Sarah looked up at Danny's imposing figure without flinching. She had faced men twice his size who were armed with automatic weapons and explosive devices. A college student, however large and aggressive, was hardly cause for concern. "I see," she said simply. "And this help, it comes in what form exactly?" Marcus realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. Sarah's calm responses to their escalating threats were making them look foolish and ineffective. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of challenge to his authority that required a decisive response. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his command authority, "you have until tomorrow evening to reconsider your attitude. Report to the old gymnasium at 2000 hours. We'll settle this question of hierarchy once and for all." Sarah nodded as if he had just invited her to a social gathering. "The old gymnasium. Tomorrow at 8. I'll be there." Her acceptance was so matter-of-fact that it left the three cadets wondering if they had somehow lost control of the confrontation. As they walked away, Danny looked back over his shoulder with confusion. "Boss, did she just agree to show up for her own beatdown?" he asked. Marcus didn't answer, his mind already working on plans for the following evening. He had issued the challenge, and she had accepted. Tomorrow night, Sarah Martinez would learn exactly what happened to cadets who refused to show proper respect for the established order. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of Riverside Military Academy as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her from the airport. She pulled her single duffel bag from the trunk, thanking the driver with a quiet nod before he drove away, leaving her standing alone in front of the imposing brick buildings that would be her home for the next 4 years. At 22, Sarah was older than most incoming cadets, but her record showed only that she was a transfer student with prior military experience. What those records didn't reveal was the depth of that experience or the scars it had left behind. She had served 3 tours with the Navy SEALs, becoming one of the first women to complete the grueling training program and serve in active combat operations. The decision to leave that life behind and pursue an education had not been easy, but the nightmares and the weight of memories had finally convinced her that she needed a different path. The academy buzzed with activity as returning students and new arrivals moved between buildings, carrying boxes and greeting friends they hadn't seen over the summer break. Sarah observed the organized chaos with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly and thoroughly. She noted the hierarchies already forming among the students, the way upperclassmen commanded respect and space, and how the nervous energy of first-year cadets created an almost visible tension in the air. As she made her way toward the administration building to complete her check-in process, Sarah became aware of 3 cadets watching her from beneath the shade of an old oak tree. They were clearly upperclassmen, their uniforms bearing the insignia of third-year students, and their body language suggested they owned this place. The tallest of the 3, a broad-shouldered young man with closely cropped blonde hair, seemed to be their leader. His companions flanked him like lieutenants, one dark-haired and lean, the other stocky with an aggressive stance that Sarah recognized from her military days. Marcus Thompson had ruled his class since arriving at Riverside 3 years ago. The son of a decorated Army general, he had grown up believing that military leadership was his birthright, and the academy had done little to challenge that assumption. His academic performance was solid, his physical fitness exemplary, and his ability to command other cadets was undeniable. He had plans that extended far beyond graduation, envisioning a career that would eventually surpass even his father's achievements. The arrival of transfer students always presented an opportunity for Marcus to demonstrate his authority and establish the pecking order early. He had developed a system over the years, a series of tests and challenges that would quickly separate the weak from the strong and ensure that everyone understood their place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. As he watched Sarah walk across the courtyard, something about her confident stride and alert posture triggered his instincts. "New meat," whispered Jake Rodriguez, Marcus's closest ally and the academy's best marksman. Jake had earned his position through unwavering loyalty and a sharp tongue that could cut down anyone who challenged their group's authority. "Looks like she thinks she's tough." The third member of their trio, Danny Chen, flexed his considerable muscles and grinned. Danny had transferred to Riverside after being kicked out of a civilian college for fighting, and he had found his niche as Marcus's enforcer. His parents had hoped that military discipline would straighten him out, but instead, he had simply learned to channel his aggression more strategically. Marcus studied Sarah's approach, noting details that his companions missed. Her posture was too perfect, too controlled. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning for threats and exits in a way that spoke of real training rather than academy discipline. Most tellingly, she carried herself with a stillness that reminded him uncomfortably of his father's most dangerous colleagues, the ones who had seen real combat and carried its weight in their bones. But Marcus had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. In his mind, this was his academy, and every cadet who walked through its gates needed to understand that fact. The military was about hierarchy and respect, and he had earned his position at the top through 3 years of proving himself superior to everyone around him. Sarah completed her administrative check-in efficiently, providing the minimal information required and deflecting the registrar's attempts at friendly conversation. She had learned long ago that the less people knew about her background, the easier it was to navigate new situations. The academy would provide structure and purpose while she figured out what came next in her life. But she had no intention of forming the kinds of close relationships that might lead to difficult questions about her past. Her dormitory assignment placed her in Bravo Company, housed in one of the Academy's newer buildings. As she climbed the stairs to the third floor, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of footsteps following behind her, multiple sets moving in coordination. She didn't turn around or change her pace, but her muscles tensed in preparation for whatever was coming. The hallway was empty when she reached her floor, but Sarah could sense the presence of others nearby. She located her room, number 314, and used her key to open the door. The space was spartanly furnished with 2 beds, 2 desks, and 2 wardrobes, everything arranged with military precision. Her roommate had not yet arrived, leaving Sarah alone to unpack her few belongings. As she placed her clothes in the wardrobe, Sarah heard voices in the hallway outside her door. They were making no effort to be quiet, clearly wanting her to know they were there. She recognized the psychology of intimidation, the way predators announced their presence to establish dominance over potential prey. It was a tactic she had seen used by bullies and enemy combatants alike, and it never failed to trigger her defensive instincts. The voices grew closer, and Sarah could make out individual words now. They were discussing her, speculating about her background and making crude jokes about her appearance. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, fighting the automatic responses that years of combat training had burned into her nervous system. This was not Afghanistan or Syria. These were not enemy soldiers. This was supposed to be a place of learning and growth, where she could build a new life away from the violence that had defined her past. But as the voices stopped directly outside her door, and she heard the deliberate sound of knuckles rapping against the wood, Sarah realized that some battles followed you wherever you went. The question was not whether she would fight, but how much of her true nature she was willing to reveal in order to win.